Thank you for joining Market News with Rodney Lake. This is a regular program for the GW Investment Institute, where we talk about timely market topics. I'm Rodney Lake, the director of the GW Investment Institute. Let's get started. Welcome back to Market News with Rodney Lake. I'm your host, Rodney Lake. And again, welcome back to the studio right here in the GW School of Business. This is a GW Investment Institute show. And today we have a special guest, Professor Sinclair. Professor Sinclair, right here from GW, Department of Economics. Thank you for coming to see us. To start with, maybe please introduce yourself a little bit further.
Sure. Hi, I'm Professor Tara Sinclair. Please call me Tara. And I have been part of the GW Economics Department for nearly 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's been quite a ride here.
Yeah, wonderful.
But I've also done a lot of other things on the side. So I was the founding economist for the Indeed Hiring Lab for
Excellent.
the job
We're going to
search
ask
site.
you about that.
Yes.
Just let's put a pin in that one.
And I was also the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Macroeconomics at the U.S. Treasury.
Right. Impressive. We're going to talk about that as well.
But in my day job here at the university, I teach macroeconomics and econometrics, and I run our Center for Economic Research.
Excellent. Well, those are all super interesting things. And, economics is near and dear to my heart. In the finance department, economics is a key feature. And we have lots of people who are trained in economics. First, people say that finance is applied economics. So I think there's certainly a great connection there. But number one, let me just start by saying thank you very much for being on the show. We're super excited to have you here and looking very much forward to talking about your work at GW. So maybe first, let's talk about your classes. So can you talk about your classes and maybe talk about the kinds of students you teach?
Sure. So I teach everything from intermediate undergraduates up through PhD students.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I've never taught freshmen, but it's but everything else in between. And most of my classes focus on tools. So econometrics, forecasting, different methods, although I also really care about macroeconomic issues. And so I sometimes teach intermediate macroeconomics for the undergrads.
And so for maybe let's dive into the classes while we're here. So for econometrics, could you just give maybe an example of what a student would encounter in an econometrics class?
Sure. So my favorite class to teach is actually undergraduate introduction to econometrics, because it's the introduction to this amazing toolkit that is really what a lot of undergrads go and apply in their early career.
Yeah.
And so they're able to do regression analysis. They'll be able to explore potential causal relationships between variables. They're able to look at data sets with whole new lenses and be
Excellent.
able to learn about the world through data and through statistical analysis.
Sounds like a great class.
It's really fun.
It's a class I should take.
Everyone should take this class. Like if there's one thing that people should take away, it's at least take an introduction to econometrics class.
Excellent. And what year typically a student takes this?
Ideally as a sophomore, but juniors and seniors as well. And then, of course, if you didn't take an undergrad, there's still plenty of time. There are introductory classes at the master's level as well.
So in addition to econometrics, what other favorite classes do you have?
Well, they're all my favorites in different ways, right? You don't want to choose your darlings too much there. But I think the course that I'm going to be teaching in the spring, I'm expecting to become one of my favorites. It's brand new.
Oh, exciting.
It's also
heard it here first,
exactly,
right?
Yeah. It's an undergraduate class, again, but it's forecasting.
Oh, excellent.
Right.
Super important.
Yes.
Relies a little bit on your background, seems like.
Exactly. It connects in with some of my research background, connects in with some of my applied work background. But it's also another opportunity to help students who've taken already an intro to econometrics class, but they want to go further and they want to see how these tools can be used.
Excellent.
And there's such a wide range of applications to forecasting. Obviously, my experience focuses on economics, but there is a lot in the finance world. I'm sure people are going to want to write papers on how to forecast the stock market, and then it will be like, wah, wah.
Super helpful, right? If you can make it work,
right? Exactly.
But it's very hard, as you pointed out.
Right.
Thank you very much. Well, sticking with GW, and we might come back to some of this, but sticking with GW, could you maybe talk about the center that you run?
Sure. So I run the Center for Economic Research, and it is a wide-ranging center because it's supporting all sorts of economic research.
Okay.
The endowed program that we have, and that was my home before I moved into the center just this past year as being the director. I was previously the director of the Steckler Forecasting Program. So it's an endowed program under the center that focuses on forecasting writ large. There's large amount of application to economic forecasting, but we've done all sorts of different kinds of forecasting.
Maybe mention a few. What would be some highlights for forecasting?
So one example, this is one really interesting one, is that Veterans Affairs Office needs to be able to predict the death of veterans in order to prepare the appropriate number of slots at veterans, what do we call those? the burial areas, right? Cemeteries.
Yes.
And so, I always get sad when I think about this.
It's tough.
But yeah,
this is the actuarial piece of it, right?
Right. But so they have to think about those cemetery plots. And so looking into the different variables that they take into consideration and how the actuarial aspect of things is different for veterans than for non-veterans.
Of course.
And those sorts of issues
it's a subset population
exactly.
that probably has very specific characteristics associated with it that others probably don't have.
Exactly. So it's a fascinating problem that is a real world application that our government agencies are needing to do.
It's important work, right? I mean, you certainly want to have, as you mentioned, this is a sad thing, but it's, it's forecasting. And so you're looking into the future. And one thing that's even sadder is not being ready and having a veteran not have a space available when it's needed and necessary. So I think that's, as you mentioned, a little sad to think about, but super important to address and do. So this is hard work. Do you have other forecasting items that you could mention? Right.
Well, so we partner with the Federal Forecasters Consortium, which is a group of over 10 different federal government agencies that do forecasting. So the Treasury is one of our partners. So even when I was working at Treasury, I was still part of this organization.
Pulling double duty there.
It definitely felt like that. Yeah. Yes. We actually hosted the conference at Treasury that year. Nice. So it was definitely double duty. So we think about issues from forecasting the government budget deficit to issues in the climate, so longer run forecasting issues. It's super wide ranging.
Excellent. Now, that's some of the things that currently happens at the Center for Economic Research. Could you maybe mention where you would like to take the center and what's the vision for the center maybe over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, well, so what we really want to do is use this center as a way to amplify the economic research that's happening at GW.
Fantastic idea.
So we want to be able to use it to help people collaborate more, to connect with funders and with grants, and basically just to better market the economic research that's already happening, as well as help people find each other and learn about other areas of research and develop our PhD students and our master's students as well. Our applied master's students are also very involved in the center.
Excellent. One of our own at the Investment Institute, Kathleen Hinman, shout out to Kathleen, is a student in the Applied Economics Master's program. All right, so we're going to come back to GW. Let's go off to some of the things you did in industry and in government. So let's tackle first industry. So you said you had worked for Indeed. And could you maybe elaborate on what you did there?
Yeah, so my time at Indeed was amazing. So I am an Indeed alum forever. I still have a lot of Indeed swag all over my house.
Excellent.
It's
a lot of fun.
It was definitely a lot of fun. But it was also an incredible work experience because I came in about 2013.
Oh, okay. So a little while ago now.
A while ago, right. Yeah. And so this was before tech firms really thought about having economists, and in particular having chief economists or econ teams as part of a tech firm.
Interesting.
And for Indeed, it made perfect sense for them to be on the vanguard of that because they are both a tech firm as well as a labor market firm.
Right.
They're a job search site.
Yeah.
So of course they're thinking about economics and how the labor market works.
Natural idea to think about those things,
right? But they also recognized they had all this amazing data.
Of course, yeah.
And they said, who could work with this data and put it together to draw economic insights that could be useful? And I popped my head up and volunteered and said, I would love to have the opportunity to work with your data. And I had this idea I was going to be able to build time series forecasting models with their data. And it took 10 years to really get to a point.
Sometimes that's what happens.
Right. It takes a long time.
I'll do this in a year.
Right. It's 100% what I thought going into it. I mean, the hubris of academics, right? But I learned so much about data structures and all the sorts of issues in terms of trying to use private sector data for these big macroeconomic questions. And then, of course, I also got to work with data scientists and learn about their work, data engineers. But then I also got to talk to recruiters and job seekers and learn about the experience. It is incredibly wide ranging in terms of what a job search means to different groups of people.
Sure. Without giving anything, away that's proprietary or the secret sauce at Indeed, could you maybe talk about some of the things that was really interesting for you while you were there?
Well, I think what's really cool about Indeed from an economics data perspective is that they had, when I was there, sites at over 60 different economies.
Yeah.
And in large part, it's similar across all those different economies. And it's really hard to get comparable data across countries.
Sure, yeah.
And so actually the ongoing academic research that I still have going with their data is taking advantage of this commonality in terms of the data and the types of markets that are happening across countries, when of course countries have been doing very, very different economic policies.
Right.
So we can use it to kind of say which economic policies look to be working better.
Yeah, interesting, and which maybe not.
Right.
That's super fun. Any expected publications forthcoming on that, or?
Well, we've got a revise and resubmit for a remote work paper. Everybody had to write a remote work paper. That was
necessary at one point.
It was necessary at one point. We were actually pretty near the beginning of that because we had a remote work tag on the job postings.
Oh, wow.
And so we could actually watch firms like suddenly try, because I was into flexible work before it was cool.
Right.
And I had actually done some earlier research on flexible work and how much job seekers wanted that.
Yeah.
And then to just see employers suddenly finally offering and just spiking in response to the pandemic and the pandemic policies. But just seeing that and then seeing it persist for such a long time, what we really saw was this structural shift where once employers realized, kind of let that technology out of the box.
Right. Hard to put back.
Very hard to put back.
And maybe a follow-up question there, maybe you're disconnected with this part of it, is there's lots of discussion around this remote work now, not to get a total sidetrack, but I'm curious if you have any insight to this, is that there's, given the pushback, do you think that this shift will shift back, or do you think that there will be a modification, maybe at the same level that it is now won't exist 3 or 5 years from now, but it will still exist? Just curious your thoughts.
Yeah, well, my own take on this is that we've really seen that Zoom and other those sorts of technologies, they existed pre-pandemic.
Right.
And what would have normally happened without the pandemic would have been a slow adoption of them evolving over time.
Okay.
And so basically we brought 5 years worth of advance forward in a few months.
Yeah.
And
Right.
and then we're still kind of settling into that. But there's still going to be continued evolution along the lines of these technologies. And I think we're still trying to figure out exactly what mix of work works for different people, different types of jobs, different employers. And so Nick Bloom at Stanford, he's got a great portfolio of research where one of the things that he's emphasizing is the importance of hybrid work, because then you get some of those benefits of flexibility, but you also continue to get the building of company culture and interaction between workers,
which is hard
and
to
mentorship.
do totally remotely.
It is. I mean, some companies do it well. Indeed was actually the team that I worked on was fully remote.
Oh, wow.
The whole time that I was there. So I did see
so
remote
you have
done
one
well.
example, yeah.
Yes, and I think some companies can do it well, but a lot of companies can't. And so you're finding that right balance.
It probably depends on the mix of jobs too. So it's probably also hard to say, like, even if it worked for this particular thing, it's hard to say, okay, extrapolate that against all sets. It may not work because the mix of things and the activities are different, and it might be harder to reproduce that same result.
Right. Well, and one of the key things that I'm really focused on and concerned about is the training and mentorship of new people into a job. Because if they aren't able to just pop by and ask somebody or easily Slack someone, if it starts to become a more complicated ordeal to get advice, get help, then we may be putting ourselves in a weaker position than if we can still have those kinds of relationships and grow that next generation of workers.
Right. And I often mention that to my students, is that, it's really important, especially when you're starting, try to be in the office as much as you can, just because until sort of the technology fully replaces that setup, it's very challenging to tackle all these things all at once, learn the job, meet the people, understand the culture of this new place. And so being in person, I think, helps some of that. And that's the advice that I also give to my students. All right. So before we move on from Indeed, and we're going to tackle next the Treasury here, what is your takeaway? Now, it sounds like you still have some ongoing work with them, but, maybe 10 years later, what's the look back right now?
In terms of the...
Just like lessons learned, most fun thing that you did, most, interesting or unexpected, outcome?
Yeah, well, I mean, so the I always say I came for the data, I stayed for the people. The people you work with really matters, and you can really have an amazing work experience, even if you're facing a lot of data challenges, which I definitely faced a lot of those. But some sense fighting in the data trenches together really built a very cohesive team. We're all still very close and text each other regularly. But I think in terms of the overall experience, there are two things I'll highlight. The first one is there's often this idea that I think is settled down a little bit, but a few years ago, there was this sense of the private companies, they have the data and they need to give the data to the government or something like that in order to be able to improve government statistics and that sort of thing. But that's not how it works at all. There isn't this magical, perfectly organized thing called the data.
Right. Nobody's busy, organizing it, for no reason.
Right. And they're not organizing it in any way that would be applicable to the government needs.
Yeah.
And so even if we did have some magical just plug in, all we'd get is, a big mess of different files that are organized in a way that makes sense for that business. And so that was one of the things we thought a lot about at Indeed is where are the pieces of data that are aligned with what we're wanting to measure anyway. And it's really hard to take things that were gathered for a completely different purpose and repurpose them. But if you look for things where job seekers are responding to questions because they're doing it in order to make their application look stronger, but then we're like, okay, then they're answering these questions probably truthfully because you don't want to get into a job that you're not actually prepared for. So
usually not. Yeah.
Right. So we would look at things like that where we would try to really align the research question with how people were using the product. But the other thing, so probably the thing I'm most proud of what we did there was we built something called the Policy Partners Policy Partner Project. I think it had 3 Ps. Triple P. The important thing was that it was a partnership with a bunch of policymakers around the world.
Interesting.
Where, and we actually started this project in response to Brexit. So we were partnering with the Bank of England with this idea that we were going to do a study about the labor market impacts of Brexit.
Interesting.
And then we realized when the pandemic hit, and we were still working on this Brexit project because research takes time, that all of the legal agreements that we had built, because that was a lot of this was about legal agreements and how are we going to share this data in a way that makes sense for the users of the Indeed products, protect them, of course, but also achieve the policymakers' goals.
You have different constituents.
Exactly, many different constituents. So you have to work with the lawyers. But because we had figured this all out for this Brexit project with the Bank of England, we said we can actually use this as a template to expand because the pandemic in some ways was like that Brexit shock, except it hit the whole world.
Yeah, everybody.
And so we were able to share data with the IMF, the World Bank, various Federal Reserve banks, other central banks around the world. And that also became something that we shared publicly. So there's still data available on the Indeed website now that's been cleaned and organized and is useful for decisions that policymakers would make, but also that governments would make.
Interesting. Well, it sounds like it was super exciting, and I appreciate you talking about it. So now let's move on to the Treasury. So you worked with Janet Yellen. Sounds super exciting and super fun. Certainly a very recognizable name and organization. Could you maybe talk about your work at the Treasury and your time there?
Sure. So first of all, I was a political appointee, and there's a small number of political appointees at most agencies and definitely at Treasury. I believe there are about 100 of us total, about 80,000 total employees. So any of these federal agencies, including the Treasury, really run by career civil servants. But there's this small group of political appointees that come in for a short period of time. And the way I like to think about it is we're just moving at 2 totally different speeds. Because the career civil servants are there. They're trying to do the deep work. They're trying to keep everything running. They're trying to keep the historical understanding of the roles going. And then we come in and we say, I've got these 3 things and I need to know them right now. And because there's this amazing team of people that are keeping track of all that information, they're able to answer my questions very quickly.
Nice.
And then of course, they have reasonable work hours. The political appointees were there for a short period of time. We can just run the whole time. But it was just an amazing experience because I learned so much. Because the way I really took it is I was there, I was coming up with some of the questions, and I was trying to anticipate what Janet Yellen was going to ask in terms of questions.
I'm sure that's not easy.
She's an amazing boss and made all of it very easy.
Excellent.
But I would either anticipate her questions or I would get her questions, and I would pass it down to the team and then collate those answers and pass them back up. So I learned a lot about packaging up information because Janet Yellen had a lot going on.
I'm sure, right?
So I needed to really get her the precise, crisp answer to her question and nothing more. Although she's an economist, so we always wanted.
There's always more.
We always wanted to talk in more depth, and occasionally there would be an opportunity for a little bit more depth on some key questions.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And what was maybe takeaway from Treasury? Like, what was the most fun thing that you did there? And you mentioned it's a shorter period of time. It's a 1 in 100. It sounds like setup. So what's the takeaway? Most fun thing, most interesting, unexpected?
Well, I think it's just the range of things because so when I was there, I had to deal with the March 2023 banking turmoil. So I had to suddenly learn about banking and the connections between banks and the real side of the economy, because that was my focus was more on what's this going to mean for GDP, employment, those sorts of things. And of course, I spent a lot of time thinking about inflation because that was a key focus at that time. But then I also got to learn about climate issues and how we think about climate for our macroeconomic forecasts and how to do that better.
Okay.
We just so wide-ranging
but obviously very topical as well.
Yes. And so every day I would go in the morning and would have no idea how my day was going to go. And that was incredibly fun.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, I'm sure that sounds like a ton of fun. And so you guys helped save the banking industry from another mess. So well done there to everyone. That seemed very short-lived, which I think everybody appreciated. But I'm sure there were people that were hurt during that. We feel for them, but certainly the system held up and prevailed and kept moving on. So let's now come back to GW. So thanks for talking about your time in industry and time in government. I think that's super important. And certainly as an educator, I'm sure that helps give such a broad, range of experience that you can share with your students, and all that work is helpful for them to understand that how big the world of economics actually is. So if they're thinking about that, so maybe let's now dive into that. So if a student is studying economics or is even thinking about studying economics, or maybe it's even just anybody who's watching our show or listening to it, what advice would you give to them about, what are the reasons to study economics?
I think there's really so many wide-ranging reasons to study economics. First and foremost, I think it's a great way to just keep various doors open, because when you're studying economics, you're learning things that could be applicable to industry, to government. You could do it as a pre-law degree. You could do it as a pre-med degree. You could do it. Economics just really gives you a breadth of exposure to a substantial amount of math, tools, as I mentioned before, with econometrics for causal analysis, thinking through historical episodes and lessons to learn from history. So it really just gives you, I think, a pretty broad exposure to how,
a great foundation for really any discipline to build on top of. That's wonderful. So the next question is, you've been here more than 20 years at GW, as you mentioned. Could you give us maybe a highlight, your maybe only at GW moment, as people like to say, or some of your favorite things from your time so far at GW?
Oh, there are so many, but I think the big one that I just revel in all the time is how much my students know about what is happening in the government, and not just the US government, but around the world. So at any one time, I can ask a question of my class about whatever's in the news, and they're not only going to have read the news, they're going to know someone who was involved in that news-making event, or they are going to be like, oh, this afternoon, actually, I have to go and work in my internship, and we're going to have to deal with that issue. I mean, it's just amazing what the students are doing in terms of their internships and in terms of just their own voracious reading of what's going on. And I think that's a really amazing set of students to have.
Well, excellent. And so maybe now moving to wrap here, thank you for spending so much time with us today. Could you talk about, what advice you would give to students? It doesn't have to be for economics, just, advice for students at GW. If I'm a student at GW, or again, if you're considering being a student maybe anywhere, what advice to be a successful student?
I think the first thing is to not feel like you have to have everything figured out. And that if you don't know what you want to do yet, that's great. Develop your foundations. get some skills. I'm a big fan of arguing for math and statistics. But
agree.
But also, developing your writing skills, those sorts of things are very important as well. And then from there, I think it will evolve over time and come. The other thing I think is really important is to get some work experience. I know lots of students who focus only on their studies. Here at GW, we have a lot of internships and great things like that a lot of students are doing. But there are still those students that are like, I have a 4.0, shouldn't I be able to get a job when they finish?
Yeah.
But getting some work experience, doing a small job during the school year or doing a summer job, I think really makes a huge difference, both in helping you identify what you do and don't like about a workplace.
Which is important.
It's very important. But also it just gives you some of those skills that might help you even communicating with professors, communicating with other people in a more formal environment that you'll learn on the job.
Well, I think that's sound advice. All right, so now to close, anything that you would like to say about the center, about yourself, any shout outs that you would like to give now?
That's great. So many shout outs. But I think I will wrap up with really encouraging students to come to our seminars. Okay. This is a great way to meet economists and to see what research economics looks like. And for a lot of people in undergrad and even in master's programs, they don't really know how economists interact as researchers unless they come and see these academic seminars. We've got seminars in microeconomics, in trade and development, in macro and international finance, as well as in forecasting. And all of those are advertised through our events page on the economics website, but also the university calendar highlights them as well. And I think that's a great opportunity to come and get involved in the little community.
Awesome. Well, I think that's where we'll end. Thank you for sharing that. So we'll wrap. I want to say thank you for spending time with us, Professor Sinclair. Good luck with all your initiatives, and thanks for bringing all this wonderful experience to GW and staying here for more than 2 decades. And hope you'll be back on the show as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you. All right. Now that's a wrap. We'll see you in the next episode of Market News with Rodney Lake. Thank you. Disclaimer, the content shared in the GW Investment Institute podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice. The opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and guest and do not necessarily reflect the views of the GW Investment Institute or the George Washington University. Listeners should not act upon the information provided without seeking professional advice from a qualified financial advisor. Investing involves risks, including the loss of principal. The GW Investment Institute, the George Washington University, and the podcast hosts do not assume any responsibility for any investment decisions made based on the content of this podcast. Always conduct your own research and consult with a financial advisor before making any investment decisions.